Hello, I'm Graham and I do hope everyone's having a great day. Welcome to part 5 of the Panasonic Lumix Bridge Camera Revisited series. Now in today's video I'm going to be looking at manual exposure. Now to help me demonstrate that today I've got the FZ1002 set up to capture this scene. I'm recording the output from the HDMI on OBS running on my Apple Mac for those interested in how this is being captured. The actual main scene is being captured by my Canon EOS 5D Mark III. Now, if you read photographic magazines or you're reading photographic books, you'll probably find a line in there that says to be a good photographer, you must be shooting in the manual mode. Now, I'll totally go against that statement. I don't believe that if you're shooting in manual mode, you're getting the best results from your camera. Particularly in a dynamic situation where lighting could be changing or your subject position changes and you get a different situation. Manual mode is ideal if you've got a situation where your subject is static and your lighting conditions are static. You will get perfect exposures for each and every one that you take. In a dynamic lighting situation or a dynamic subject movement position, you're going to end up with pictures that are going to be underexposed or overexposed. You'll get more throwaways than you're going to get keepers. And I'm going to prove that in today's video. Now, exposure is really just understanding the exposure triangle. And in some respects, it's far easier if you understand exposure to be controlled just by aperture and shutter, as we want to try and keep the camera set to its lowest ISO or its native ISO, so you're going to get the lowest noise and the best dynamic range, the best color tone out of that camera. So in the case of the FZ1002 or the FZ1000 or the FZ2000, you're going to be using ISO 125. With the FZ300, you're going to be using ISO 100. And if you've got the FZ80 or 82, then you can be using ISO 80. So those are the native ISOs, and those I would recommend you set the camera to for almost every shot that you take, unless there's insufficient light to enable you to capture the pictures that you're after. So having set the ISO to 125, you've forgotten one side of the exposure triangle already. So you're only dealing now with shutter speed or aperture. Remember, aperture governs the amount of depth of field. So if you want a shallow depth of field, you're going to be using a wider aperture such as f2.8, f3.2, f4. Want more depth of field, then you're going to be using f5.6, f8 or f11 in the case of the 1-inch sensor cameras. If you wanted to have subject motion blur for waterfalls, then you're going to be using shutter priority, where you can set the shutter down to say half a second or 1 second to create those long flowing silky streams. If you wanted to capture fast action like hummingbirds flying or sports, you're going to be setting a fast shutter speed, say 1,000th of a second or 2,000th of a second, where you want to capture and arrest subject motion blur. So those are the two choices, and it's up to you for your particular genre of photography which one you're going to go for. Now, I am going to verify the statement that I made earlier on that it really doesn't matter whether you shoot aperture priority mode, shutter priority mode, or manual mode. The exposure on that sensor is going to be the same, so the end result that you'll get on the file on the SD card is exactly the same. So let me put my glasses on and switch over to the output coming from the HDMI output from this camera so we can see the back of the screen. So you can see we're in aperture priority mode as indicated by the A on the top left hand side of the screen. Down below where the audio level meters are fluctuating, you can see we've got an aperture set of f5. And if you move over to the right hand side of the screen at the bottom, you can see we've got ISO 125, which I stated before is the native ISO for this camera, and that's the recommendation I'll make for you to shoot all your images at. So f5 at the moment. For this particular scene, I might want to use f4. So to choose f4, obviously I just use the top control dial or the back control dial on this particular camera to set the aperture that I want. So I want to go for f4. So when I've got f4, the camera will automatically calculate the shutter speed the moment that I depress the shutter button to halfway down, and you can see it's calculated the exposure to be 1/40th of a second. So I'm going to take that picture. So that's the picture captured, and on screen you can see it 1/40th f4 ISO 125. So now I'm going to go into shutter priority mode by turning the mode dial to the S position. You can see that on the LCD we've got the S. So you can see at the moment in the shutter priority mode my previous exposure was 1/60th of a second, and that's given me an aperture of f3.3. But I want to take this picture with an aperture of f4. So to do that, I'll just change my shutter speed until that f-stop number goes to f4. So with the FZ1002 or the FZ1000, just use the top control dial or the front control dial to change the shutter speed. If I change the shutter speed, I'm just going to have to press the shutter button to get the exposure meter back up. Change the shutter speed, and what's the aperture? There's the aperture gone to f4, and that's my shutter speed, 1/40th of a second again. So let's take that picture. You can verify it there, 1/40th of a second, f4, ISO 125. So it's exactly the same exposure as we had in the aperture priority mode. Now I'm going to switch over to manual. So I've got to manual, and what I'm going to do is change the aperture, and I'm going to change the shutter speed randomly so we've got a different situation. So at the moment I've got f8 and 1/25th of a second, and you can see in the center of the screen at the bottom the exposure meter. You've got the -3 and 0, and the scale is heading towards the minus direction, so it's telling us that this scene is underexposed by 1 1/3 of an EV stop. So you can see that on the exposure meter. So to correct it, you need to change either the duration of the shutter speed or change the aperture to allow more light in. So I wanted an aperture of f4 for this particular shot. So I'm going to start by dialing in f4 with the front control dial on the FZ1002. So I've got to f4. Now you can see the exposure meter has gone to the plus side. So we are now overexposed by 2/3 of an EV. So to correct that, I need to shorten the shutter speed. So I'm going to use the back control dial, which changes the shutter speed, and I'm going to go to a faster shutter speed. That's 1/30th, 1/40th of a second, and now see the exposure meter is showing plus and minus 0. So that means the exposure meter has got the center point, or we're at the correct exposure. You can see that we've got 1/40th, f4, ISO 125, which is exactly the same exposure we had with shutter priority as with aperture priority, and if we look at that in the video, there's absolutely no difference whatsoever between aperture priority, shutter priority and manual mode. Now, to show you how difficult it is with a dynamic situation, if a cloud passes over the sun when you're taking a picture outdoors, I'm going to simulate that by causing a shadow to go across the model here. You can see the exposure is now gone to -1 stop underexposed. So to correct that, I'm going to have to change my shutter speed, as I want to keep this aperture to f4. So to correct that, I'm going to have to increase the shutter speed to allow me to bring that exposure back to the center point. So there I've got the exposure. I've had to go to a 15th of a second. Then we take the picture, and that's taken me something like 15 seconds to get to the right exposure. Now, if I go back into aperture priority mode, for example, there's our exposure. It should still be a 1/40th because the sun is still out. Then the sun comes in, blocks my shadow. I press the shutter button and take the picture, and the camera has automatically corrected the shutter speed for me, stopped it down to that 1/15th of a second to give me the correct exposure. So in a dynamic lighting situation where the lighting's changing, either the sun going behind clouds or something like that, aperture priority and shutter priority uses the computational set of the camera to change that exposure in the blink of an eye. Where in manual mode, you're going to have to think of which you're going to have to change, whether you're changing shutter speed or aperture, depending on whether you want depth of field or subject motion blur. Make that change, and you've wasted maybe 10 seconds where it's taken just the press of a button in aperture or shutter priority mode. Now, a question that came up on one of my emails recently was, how do you use exposure value compensation when you're in a manual mode anyway? And the answer to that is you don't. There is no exposure compensation facility with these cameras when you're in the manual mode. If you're in aperture priority or shutter priority mode, then you've got the function 2, or you press the back control wheel in to give you exposure compensation adjustments. In manual mode, it's you who sets that exposure compensation. So for example, let's go back into the manual mode. And you can see at the moment the meter is showing an exposure of 1 1/3 stop overexposed. Now, if I wanted it to be 1 stop overexposed, then I can change either the shutter speed or I can change my aperture. So I've just changed my shutter speed, made it shorter. You can see that we've now gone to +1 EV over. And if I continue to make that shutter speed longer, we're letting more light and integrate onto the sensor, we come back to the 1/40th at f4, which was the normal balance point. If I wanted it to be slightly underexposed, then I can use the shorter shutter speeds to give me that underexposed EV. Now you'll be using exposure compensation in situations where the scene type is fooling the meter. Snow scenes, beach scenes, backlit scenes all will fool the meter. So in that situation you'll be using exposure compensation in your semi-automatic modes. Here in the manual mode, it's you that will make the change by using your adjustment, either shutter speed or aperture, to give you the amount of underexposure that you need, or overexposure in the case of snow scenes. So there we are, that is manual exposure, and as you saw from that, there's nothing very complicated about it. It's just understanding the relationship between aperture and shutter and how that governs the exposure. So that is manual exposure, and I hope you found that useful. If you're a new viewer, please do click that subscribe button and bell notification icon to be advised when I upload new videos in the series. And if you haven't seen my photographic blog, I'll put a link to that in the video description below. You'll find lots more information on all things Panasonic Lumix and bridge cameras, so do check that out. And if you want to join my newsletter group, that's a party now of 3,800 people. That newsletter, which is a technical newsletter in its own right, goes out between 4 and 6 weeks, depending on the time I've got to put it together. There will be one going out at the end of October, so if you subscribe immediately, you'll get the one going out at the end of October. So, until the next video, thanks again for watching. Please do take care, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Goodbye for now.